Okay, thank you. All right, cool. So thank you all very much for being here. Extremely excited to be here. Believe it or not my first time in Beirut. I've been there physically doing talks, but that was around 2015. Sadly, this time around, like 6 years later, we're gonna have to do it online, but super excited, to be in Lebanon once again. Okay, also I wanna do a bit of paperwork. So thank you very much to Abdurrahman for having me, for the invitation. Extremely excited to be here. Today's talk is gonna be about, the aspect of starting, which is basically navigating the software development world. And I wanted to focus on two aspects in here. You could either do it as somebody who's extremely passionate and you just want to do it for fun, or you can either do it, for the sake of business if you want to profit. So I want to just have multiple, I have multiple pointers in here and I'm going to navigate them. And by the end of this session, you can always ask me if you have anything, regarding this. Okay, cool. Okay, so first things first, my name is Amin Al-Tajer. Thanks for having me again. You can always reach out to me at aminaltajer.com, where I keep my personal portfolio and a lot of my work and my blog as well. I'm also reachable on Instagram and Twitter. Honestly, heavily reachable there, something that my wife doesn't really appreciate. But yeah, it's at Amin Al-Tajer. And I'm currently serving as the CEO of Infiniteware. We are an AI business. We started around 2008. We actually started by building AI products for a different discipline, which is game development, something that I'm extremely fond of. But then we switched to, machine learning and artificial intelligence full-time, maybe 7 or 6 years back. Okay, that's about me. And yeah, a couple of our clients, I'm not going to spend much time in here. You can always go back here. And, a couple of products that we've done, spanning artificial intelligence. Okay, cool. All right, so the million-dollar question is, why be good at software? I mean, do you really want to be good at software just because, you want to impress somebody, or you want to do it because you want to start up a business, or, you want to do it because you want to get a really cool job, in a company that you really appreciate and admire? Well, for me personally, the why of it is really personal, and everyone has their own, why personally. So I'm not going to dig into that a lot, but I'm just going to say that, the why really differs and everyone has their own why. So be very sincere with yourself if you're talking about, why why you want to be in this, key area. And there's a lot, there's a lot of stuff happening in here. However, if we want to talk about the two main aspects that people go to, when we're talking about software development, you got to understand that it's either finding a decent job, that appreciates what you have to offer, or, you want to start up your own business, your own venture, which is also very exciting. However, there are multiple challenges in that space, and we want to navigate those because it's extremely important to know, what you're against in this fight. Okay, the one thing that is extremely common for those two disciplines, whether you're doing a business or whether you're going for a job, is that you got to understand that this sort of discipline takes a lot of time. Reason is, but inherently this discipline, software development in the IT world, is it's just basically, it changes a lot. It changes not only by the hour, it changes by the second. So you've got more frameworks happening every single day. You've got people coming up with ideas and demos, and new languages happening, new platforms, and new SDKs to figure out. So it takes a lot of time. So when I talk to people about software development, I always tell them it's more of a lifestyle. So it's not for everyone. If you're not that keen when it comes to keeping up with other people and other news spanning software development, it might not be for you, because there are other fields that have, let's say, a slower pace when it comes to change. But software development, just like the other disciplines in the IT world, changes by the second, and it's not for everyone. So you got to make sure that you really appreciate and understand that specific point in here. Otherwise, you're going to have a very rough time going forward in your journey. The other aspect is there's a lot of efforts that you have to do on your part. You see, software development is not like, writing poetry. And look, even poetry is a really bad example here. But what I'm trying to say, when you read magazines, when you give speeches most of the time, it's very debatable that in software development you're going to have to put a lot more effort, because software, just like any other practical discipline, requires a huge amount of experimentation, a huge amount of practice, and software really, really defines the practical aspect of of that journey. If you can't just read about software development, you have to practice it. You have to really get your hands dirty with it, and this is something that not a lot of people really appreciate, again, because it takes a lot of time and it's sometimes extremely demanding and frustrating. By the way, it's super frustrating because not everything goes according to your plan. Sometimes you have to experiment and figure out what the hell is happening, read documents, see examples, experiment, and go back and forth into in multiple circles before you figure out what you have to do. So again, it takes a lot of effort. And last but not least, you gotta be mentally stable. For this sort of discipline, it's very demanding, honestly. It's very demanding on the mind. There's a lot of details to care about, a lot of stuff that you have to focus on. It's not for the faint-hearted. So yeah, I just wanted to bring it to your attention that to be in this field, you got to be very careful, what you're getting yourself into in terms of time, in terms of efforts, and your mental stability. It's a very long journey, so you might as well enjoy it and be very, very careful when it comes to doing your about navigating basically your steps in your journey. But for me personally, mental stability is a really superb deal. You got to make sure that you take it easy, especially when we're talking about careers. It's very likely that you're going to work for somebody that doesn't understand, the craft of software development. They would require you, for example, to do a project in a very short time frame, or to do things that are probably not feasible from the first glance of it. But understanding those topics and is letting them sink in, understanding the scope of your work, how to handle people is a important trait to have, especially if you're in this field. I know in every other field there's a different extent to it, but in software development you can go really, really far when it comes to the mental stability aspect. Okay, cool. Now the way I really distribute is that you have two hats that you can wear if you're starting in software development. You could either, as I said, be a technical person, who lives and breathes basically software and code, or you can still understand the craft, but you can look at it from a business perspective. Now, here's a very important distinctive factor to understand. It's really important to understand that even if you're a business person who want to have a business surrounding the software development umbrella, you still got to understand some of those ideas in here. It's you know how many times I've seen people talking about building a great product, and just jamming multiple features in their pitch deck, but look, in the end of the day, nothing happens. And the greatest factor to that is that most of them just promise and think that it's like connecting Lego parts, putting Lego parts on top of each other. But the reality is software development is very specific. It's very distinct. You got to understand how everything works on the inside. This is why having your hands dirty sometimes is really beneficial for your expectations and how to transfer those expectations to your client as well. So what I'm trying to say here, whether you're a technical person or even if you're a business person at heart, you got to understand that software development has multiple traits that you got to understand from the get-go. Okay, cool. Let us take the Techie hat and just navigate some of the elements in here. The first one is, if you want to be in that space, if you want to be in the technical space and you figured out that you want to wear the technical hat, you want to act as a CDO, you want to act as somebody who just, as I said, lives and breathes software or code, you got to be good at it. You got to be good when it comes to development. So that means, imagine you want to pick up, C# as a programming language. You got to really have a lot of experience in C#. It's not just tinkering with multiple examples and you call it a day. Building a product, building a resilient, a good product really revolves around the idea of knowing your platform, knowing your tools. And software is very similar to that. So even though you can experiment with multiple programming languages, but focusing on multiple ones that you want to be an expert on is the key to survival, because people are going to come to you because they believe that you know that platform really, really well. They're not going to come to you because, that they heard that you know how to handle, for example, C#. They want to come to you because they know that you know C# pretty well. And so having a programming language in mind, having a specific code base that you're familiar with is really key for your survival. So as a technical person, it's cool to navigate and experiment every now and then, but getting one platform that you're really good at is the key to survival. Also, even if you're a developer, if you're a hardcore developer, you got to give some time to documentation. Believe it or not, the world doesn't really revolve around us. You're going to be working with other developers, and these developers are going to probably want to kill you when they see your code and it's not documented, or if it's really difficult to read, difficult to understand. So documenting your code can go a long mile. You can either document it using your comments, for example, when you have extensive comments that describe the whole thing, or when you have a really, a clear code base that is, extremely clear, that it doesn't need anybody to go and explain, with documentation, like in terms of comments or other material as well. But the idea is you got to be good when it comes to documenting your work. If you're building an API, you got to make sure that your API is documented, because eventually somebody else is going to consume your API, whether it's a REST API, gRPC, or whatever it is. But essentially what happens under the hood is that people are going to go and they would want to interact with your work, and without any documentation, they're not going to be able to, and they're going to have a very rough time. And documentation, as I said, is not just necessarily within the code itself. It's having a specific documentation in terms of documents, or in terms of videos. Sometimes depends exactly on the discipline. So if I'm building an example, if I'm building, let's say, a platform, I would definitely want my developers to understand how to deal with the platform, either by having, the SDK with examples, with sample code bases that they can rely on, really clear, explanation of each single function or method within my platform, and those variables inside. Because, it's crazy how people use your work in different capacities. So you wouldn't just want to go ahead and put your work as it is without any documentation and expect people to go ahead and maximize the potential of your work. You got to really make sure it's documented well. And this is why when we're talking about a complicated platform like Android, for example, you can really see the extent of what Google has to do in that space. The documentation itself, the documentation portal itself, is like a project on its own. So that gives you a clear idea of how, developers really take documentation super seriously. Okay, cool. So this is for documentation. Another aspect that I want to also shed some light on is the idea of deployment. Now, when you build applications, sometimes people focus on the code itself, but without having a clear idea or a clear plan onto how to deploy to other customers, to deploy quick, for other people, whether we're talking about testing or development or staging or whatever pipeline that you're working on. But the idea is you want to have a proper deployment strategy. And as a developer, this is also a priority as well that you have to put on your plate. It's not about developing the code on its own and then you manually putting, some of those binaries or applications on production manually. You got to understand how to streamline the whole process, rely on a DevOps pipeline, for example, to streamline the whole process, from the source code itself, from the repository that contains your source code, all the way, to your production environments where you're going to run your application for, the whole wide world, basically, for your customers. And so getting acquainted with this notion of deployment in DevOps is also extremely key for your survival in this age. As everything is now going super fast, there are customers that want to have changes by the second. Not everyone can afford to wait for 2 days or 3 days, for example, to deploy changes. Now, if you go to a notoriously difficult, or let's say notoriously delayed industry, let's take banking, for example. Sometimes when you deal with corporate banks, you can see developers in there deploying in terms of days. But the reality is, if you take a product like Twitter or Facebook or some of those really fast-paced tools, these people don't live, under the unit of days, basically, the unit of day. They work under the unit of seconds. And so getting equated again with the subject of deployment is also one of the core skills that you want to understand deeply before you get into this space commercially, as I said, whether you're looking for a job or you're building a product on your own, as a business. Okay, now this is one of the most favorite aspects that I'd like to talk about. So artificial intelligence is now the hype. It's crazy. Everyone talks about it. Everyone's just basically going crazy about it. But the one notion that you got to pick up from all of this craze is that data literacy is it's extremely important. If you're building a product, you might not really utilize artificial intelligence from the get-go, but the downside is if you build a product, and you spend a lot of time on the product without giving a lot of regard to data, to the infrastructure itself that powers that sort of workload, it's going to become very apparent as you navigate, your journey. I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to mean here. So I've worked with a lot of customers, and their main notion and their main, let's say, yearn is that they want to add artificial intelligence into one of their core products or services. But when it comes down to it, and you ask them for the basics of doing such a thing, essentially getting digital data to work with, most of my customers, maybe 5 or 6 years back, didn't have did not really appreciate the concept of data or putting the data in an infrastructure that is capable of doing such a use case. And so what I'm trying to say, even though you're working with code, be it doing games or doing any sort of work that involves code, you also want to have that sort of literacy where you deal with data and understand how to manipulate data, how to clean data, because ultimately there's a huge chance that you're going to add a use case that revolves around the idea of data, whether you're doing a machine learning model or you're just basically doing analytics or anything of that sort. But having a data-oriented literacy is very imperative for you to be in that space, even if you're just, as I said, focusing on other disciplines. Another aspect that I feel that a lot of people are picking up really fast nowadays is that the idea of software revisioning or source control management. Now, back in my, back 20 years back or so, the idea of, source control management was not really that popular among the youth, let's say, among young developers. And that is because it was extremely difficult to deal with something like CVS. And I'm not sure if you heard about CVS, but, we got now so CVS is a source control management tool, and then it got superseded by something very popular that goes by the name of SVN. So SVN. So these tools were designed in a specific mindset where you can't really build large pace projects, honestly. And this is why Git came on board. Now, Git is the brainchild, basically, of Linus Torvalds, the guy who created Linux, and he has some really good ideas, some really good philosophy as well, when it comes to building that product on its own. So there's a lot of stuff happening in that space, but you got to understand, in this age, if you want to work, if you want to collaborate with other people, if you want to build really cool projects and services, there's no way around it. You got to get your hands dirty with Git, because Git is now the de facto standard for projects and services across the world. You got to be very confident when it comes to reversing code, submitting code, understanding the hygiene behind, submitting code, reverting, understanding how to write your own messages within it, how to manage multiple branches, how to branch out, how to merge. All of these core skills are extremely important in this age. And if you haven't heard about Git, it is the time now to go and understand how it works, because there's no way around the idea of dealing with Git. Even if you don't work with other people as well, it's a mandatory tool to save your progress, to go back in time and understand how things really change in your product and your service. You can figure out why a specific exploit happens in your product. And so it's a imperative tool in your tool set, basically. Even if you're not yeah, you got to go for the multiple commands in Git. But generally speaking, Git takes a bit of fair time to get acquainted with. It's not as easy as it sounds. You can really go complicated with it if you want. But generally speaking, Git has a large community now. It's being used, as you probably know, with GitHub and other popular places for software development. But my ultimate 2 cents in here is just understand Git in the best way possible. You got to be very careful with it. You got to be very confident with it, because there's a plethora of different use cases that happen across the world when it comes to doing things with software. So you got to make sure how to deal with Git to quickly change things on production or in test, manage multiple production if you have a bug fix that you want to work on, for example. So yeah, I'm not going to focus more in here, but what I'm trying to say is get really good with Git. Another aspect that I feel that a lot of people don't really appreciate that much is that a lot of developers generally program or develop systems according to their favorite language. And I gotta understand that. I definitely understand that. However, it is not the best choice. It's not the best course of action. And so when you feel comfortable with the language, let's say like C++ or C or C#, it doesn't mean that it is going to hold for every specific use case that you have. It sometimes might really fail you big time depending on the use case and the workload that you're getting your hands on. And so a responsible person, a responsible professional is going to really choose the technology stack with no bias whatsoever, with no bias of the language that you love, that you like, or how developers feel about a certain language or certain technology stack. You got to really put all of your options and compare them, because every single use case, has different requirements, different constraints. A good example is if you're relying on a new library that just went out, there's a huge chance that you're going to be in a very difficult spot down the line if that library doesn't get, the support that it deserves. Another example is you don't want to base your work on a language that is solely developed for low-level development, and you want to get that language and put it in a difficult and a sophisticated system. A good example with that is C++. Generally, a good example that I like to tell people about is generally targeting low-level development. If you're building a game, in a low-level game, for example, we're not talking about mobile and stuff. If you want to build a console application, you probably want to use C for operating systems. You want to use assembly for really low-level control over the hardware. You wouldn't really want to use assembly to build, let's say, a Windows application at this stage, or you wouldn't want to use let's say C++ for applications that don't really involve performance. And so choosing the technology stack is a very difficult choice, and it takes years of experience to really figure out where to go next, in your choice of technology stack. But my 2 cents here again is that really understand well what you're choosing, because that can really bite you so bad in the back down the line if you don't choose it well. And this is where experience comes in. All right, cool. One of the main aspects that a lot of developers avoid, but here's the truth. You also need to have really good communication skills. You're not going to really go very far if you don't have any communication skills laying around in your tool set. Eventually, in big projects, even in compact projects, if you're doing it with 2 people or 3 people, you got to understand how to talk to these people, how to convey your ideas, whether they're technical, whether they're functional. So telling them what to do, explaining to them certain requirements takes a certain level of communication, and you got to make sure that you have what it takes to explain ideas in the most compact form, without fluff, without these things. They will just make your case much more complicated. So when I say communication, I'm talking about speaking, I'm talking about writing, I'm talking about other elements, listening as well. Listening is a pretty big deal. Sometimes you get good ideas from other people as well. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, learn to make elevator pitches as well. So try and practice to convey your message in the shortest way possible when you're talking to other people, because most of the time, who now has time to stay around and really just stay still and basically absorb large amounts of text and verbal fluff. You got to make sure that your communication or your message that you want to convey is as short as possible and as beautiful as possible for people, and as clear as possible as well, for people to understand. And with development and with software development, this is really crucial, because if you fail to understand what people have to say, you can really screw up your product, whether we're talking about security, whether we're talking about functionality or user experience. So the key here is communication again. And you got to stay up to date. This field, as I said, is extremely demanding. You wouldn't really expect to use the same framework that you've used 10 years ago, in today's terms. Being up to date is a huge burden. Not everyone is a big fan of it. You got to dedicate the time to read. You got to dedicate the time to practice, just like any other discipline. But it is very apparent when we're talking about software development. So my 2 cents, trying to have a specific program or agenda to go and get acquainted with these things. Have favorite blogs to read on weekends if you can. Try to squeeze multiple blog articles or tweets or people that you really respect on Twitter that are relevant to your discipline, to read their tweets, let's say during a meal if you can, if you don't want to talk to somebody else or have a conversation. But having a specific program that gets you up to speed is something that is extremely important. And I always say, before I close on, the tech responsibilities here, adopt the SUN model, SUN, S-U-N. And S means, so I'm just trying to remember here, but U stands for updates, N is for network, and S has something to do with, really study or something like that. But the idea is you want to basically get better what you do, get better. And then the second thing is you want to get updates as much as possible in this space. And the third thing is you got to be, a node within a network. You got to understand what's happening out there. Have friends that talk about software development. Have people who, form this sort of forum, for you, because you're not going to work on your own. There's a huge chance that you're going to be working with people. And so getting those skills up to date, up to standard is the best way to go, even though you have technical elements that you need to conquer as well. Yeah, and given that I work in machine learning most of the time, I wanted to also put this to your attention here. Sometimes reading about stuff, as on blogs or as on documentation is not the only way to go. Sometimes it's so cool to read research papers, and you can get a lot of value out of research papers. And this is very dominant if we're talking about machine learning, given that machine learning is predominantly an academic field at heart, before it got so practical in the last couple of years. But going over some of the most recent research papers can really widen your horizon. It can really show you where to go next, some ideas that you can implement. And what's so cool about research papers is that most of the time you're not going to get an implementation unless the writer or the author is really generous. But the idea is it's all about getting new ideas that you can implement on your own. And so that really opens up the door for new products and services, even for talking about machine learning in here, given that it's just the norm to use research papers in that space. But yeah, if you get the chance, also widen your horizon by reading some of those research papers. And there are really great websites that offer research papers on computer science, on specific practical use cases for machine learning. So yeah, just make sure that you read those. Okay, so here's, just like what I said, some of the most important aspects that I wanted to raise to your attention, especially for a techie, in this space. Let's talk about the business hat here. somebody who wants to work in that space in software development, but they want to focus on the business aspect of it. Now, it's really important, and I cannot stress on that enough, to really build a reliable business model for monetization. Eventually, for starting a development business, you want to profit for different purposes. You either want to have it as a career, to not have a job to begin with, or you want to build a product just for the sake of deploying a product out there for people to be happy about. But the idea is profiting is very dependent on your business model. And your business model, is the way for your business to survive. And so taking the time to understand how you're going to take money from people, how you're going to monetize, is definitely worthwhile in the very beginning. You don't want to go ahead and just, build a software product, for example, without really focusing on a resilient business model. I've seen a lot of people building really cool products and services. However, their pricing scheme, their business model is so bad that they have to close, again after a while, because it doesn't sustain. It doesn't really sustain down the line. And so having a resilient, as I said, business model, understand how your customers are going to behave, for different business models. Do these people like subscription-based models, or are your clients mostly reliant on a standalone flat fee, for example, for the registration? You got to really calculate it well from the get-go, so you can understand how you're going to sustain your business and how you're going to grow down the line as well. So business model, monetization, really important schemes to figure out from the get-go. Also, something that a lot of software developers hate is the idea of pitching. But if you're intended to pick up that hat, which is the software development hat in here, you got to really be good when it comes to conveying messages on stage. That means, just basically throwing the fear out of the window, being comfortable on stage, being very convincing, understanding how to control your tone on stage, controlling your verbal pace. All of these core skills are really important if you want to deliver your message in the best way possible. Yeah, so practicing makes you really good. And so even for something like pitching your product or service for investors or for clients requires a lot of practice. You can't just go ahead and wing it most of the time, unless you're extremely, respectable in that space. But the idea is you want to practice your pitch every now and then. You got to make sure that you know how to use the specific language that your audience understands. If you're pitching for a venture capital, for example, you'll probably use jargon mostly relevant to their space, to what they want to hear. If you're pitching or you're giving information, or let's say a technical talk, you would want to put information in the frequency that these people understand, which is the technical jargon behind it. And so you can go a long way, basically, when it comes to communicating again. But the idea is, when it comes to pitching as a business person, make sure you have the practice that you need beforehand. You stress on the ideas that you want to stress on, and just be very confident, and just throw that fear out of the window, basically. Another aspect that you got to focus on is the idea of marketing. Now, if you have a great product and it's in the kitchen, then what's the point if nobody's going to use it? And this is the whole purpose of marketing. So marketing is you taking the world by storm, by surprise, to showcase to people that there's actually a need for the kind of work that you're doing, whether it's a product or a service. And so having a lot of work in that space is really crucial and key. And sometimes a lot of people do it in a very wrong order. Some people build their product and then start marketing the hell out of the product, which is sometimes not really a good idea, because sometimes you want to build up the hype as you go, in building your product. And so a good strategy is, to sometimes get valid use cases of your product as you're building it, and then market the hell out of that in order to grab attention and get, all the attention that you probably need. So when you're there, when you're going live, there's definitely a huge army of people that are in a dire need to use your platform or system. And so marketing is an important deal. And when we're talking about software development, lingo is the key as well. So targeting, if you're targeting, let's say your average Joe, if you're targeting a technical person, every specific audience type requires a specific jargon to use. And so you wouldn't want to use very primitive keywords with somebody who's extremely technical, if your product is extremely technical, let's say, or very specific in niche. And so targeting, understanding how to talk to your proper audience is something that you want to focus on from the very beginning as you're building your product. Okay, one of the most difficult aspects to really conquer is the aspect of hiring and reliability. As a practical person, as somebody who works in this space, hiring is not going to be an easy deal. Hiring has multiple criteria that your employees have to meet. First thing is competency. You got to hire somebody that knows what the hell they're doing, especially in your product and your service. If you're building, let's say, a platform on top of .NET, bring somebody who knows .NET, not somebody who's going to learn on top of your back, on .NET. So it really differs. It really depends on how tolerant you are in building your company, and there's a sweet balance that we have to get, between getting people to learn and getting people to actually build something meaningful and useful. And so when you're hiring from the get-go, you'll probably want to hire seniors, people who know what they're doing and they're not going to be learning much on the job. And so hiring reliable engineers is one of the key elements that your HR, that the HR has to focus on from the get-go. It's not about the accent. It's about really important aspects. It's about the competency, communication skills, passion about the subject. Because when you have somebody, and again, this is very debatable. It's very likely that you're going to have people who want to do the job because they're interested in the profit aspect of it. And there's no harm about that. There is no, you cannot blame people when they're interested in the job because it pays really good. But hiring somebody with a huge level of competency is the only way to sustain your business, because you don't have a lot of time, especially if you're a startup. If you're building something and you're running on a specific, let's say, amount of fuel and or funding in this case. And so hiring good people and reliable people is an aspect that you gotta really focus on by scrutinize and vetting these profiles really, really well. And you want to make sure that your environment also has what it takes in terms of challenge and compensation as well to keep these people within your company. So the most difficult aspect for businesses is that when you build something and it's so complicated and then your engineers basically leave you because they want to go somewhere else because you're not providing to them what it takes for them to stay, whether you're giving them a challenge or you're giving them the perfect compensation. And again, I know this is debatable, but I just gotta say that hiring is not as easy as it sounds. It's much more difficult and there's a lot of factors involved. So having a proper reliability and hiring strategy is a very important thing to focus on. Also, I've seen a lot of people building products and services without giving much regards when it comes to the legality aspect of it or the law. So when you're building a business, there are going to be competitors, there are going to be people who want to take you down. So you got to make sure everything is clear from the get-go against the law. You want to make sure you have contracts, proper contracts, non-disclosure agreements as well. You got to have a lawyer as well aiding in this whole process, or a lawyer on a retainer, somebody to go back to in case you have any sort of consultation, that you want to ask about. And so legalities, law are very huge, especially in a world that revolves around intellectual property. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand how severe this is, especially if you're doing this as a business. And I've seen a lot of businesses really fail because they did not have this aspect taken care of from the get-go, and then they suffered big time, either by a lawsuit or either by basically threats from different companies, and then you're left, your company's basically left to dust because there's nothing that you can do legally if you're not really that prepared. And connections. you can never go wrong when you get better connections and more connections with time. Now, believe it or not, humans are really funny. It's not about you being good on the job. The biggest opportunities are actually taken by people who are really well connected. And so having good connections, making sure that you touch base with other people, connect with them, make sure that you touch base with your friends and other people that can get you access in the industry and the business is a mandatory requirement every business person will have to do. If you're a CEO, you got to make sure you expand your horizon, always stay in touch with other people that you feel that you're gonna be dealing with anytime soon. Also, networking and events, just like what I said in the Sun model, networking, making sure people know who you are, the kind of services that you're providing, is also a defining aspect, a defining factor in making you succeed in this journey. Because what's the point of you developing your work, building great products and services if nobody's going to really take your work and put it to work as well? So yeah, one thing to focus on. There's also, I wanted to mention this specific point that I feel that not many developers appreciate. It's getting better now. However, there's a huge chunk of people that still don't do this. When we're talking about software development or any practical use case, practical discipline, you got to make sure you have a portfolio or a demo of some sort for the kind of work that you've done in the past. This is the best way to land in new gigs, in new deals, because it's much easier to show people what you've done, rather than you just telling them of what you're going to do or what you're going to build for them. And so having a decent portfolio, a demo of some sort, is much more convincing when you're trying to land a deal, basically, or even build a product or service. Having demos to showcase to people what they're going to get really, really soon is a brilliant work that you also need to stress on. And a few points before we close up on the session. A few things to really consider before you go crazy on your software journey. Again, I want to focus on the idea of the DevOps, or the idea of building a streamlined pipeline to take your code all the way from the repository again to the very last destination, which is your production environment. Getting hands-on with tools like Jenkins, Code Pipeline, Code Build by AWS, for example, is a great way to get acquainted with this methodology and this field. Without it, you're going to have a very rough time building let's say, in an agile environment. Most companies now adopt agile environments like Scrum and one of those things. And so by having these tools that can support that kind of mentality or school, you're going to be in a very good position, to build fast-paced products and services. Also, whether you're a technical person or a business person, it doesn't really matter that much, but experimentation is sometimes very key for you to expand your horizon. Whether you want to tackle a new market, tackle a new, let's say, segment or a demography. So experimentation is fine in your business or even in software in general, but I would really stress on the idea of specialization. Specialization can get you very, very far. And actually, Google says that a lot of the time. They all look, their philosophy, they say, specialize in one thing, I think, and get good at it, something like that, something within those lines. But the idea is getting specialized in something makes you special for other people, makes you indispensable for other people. Because what's the point of you being mediocre, in this space, being somebody that does generic websites, let's say, or something like that? Having a specialization that you can be really good at can get you really better deals, whether you're doing services in terms of compensation or even in terms of recognition as well. Getting recognized in a specific field is much more credible, in my humble opinion, or much more crediting other than just doing small gigs here and there, with no specific focus in mind. Last but not least, it's all about perseverance. Being in this field, it's not easy, especially if you're starting. And so having the perseverance is something that you want to adopt from the very beginning. There are times that you're going to hate yourself doing software, that you're going to probably slam your machine or your laptop, but that is extremely fine because not everything really works, according to plan all the time. So have that perseverance from the very beginning, because you're going to need it down the line. And yeah, I mean, just enjoy your adventure. I mean, we're all having fun. Software development is cool, whether you're doing it for business or software, but have fun. So when you compare software development to other ventures or other disciplines, software is by far much more exciting, even though it's demanding, but you get to work with new things every single day. You get to experiment with complicated technologies, things that can really change people's lives. I mean, if you want to see it from that angle, you can build custom products and services. You can really let your imagination, take the trip and build things from scratch. And that is not something that you get to witness every single day. So my last 2 cents in here before I close, you guys got to enjoy your adventure if you're doing software development. It's a lifestyle, but however, it's really, it's wonderful. There's a lot of benefits to it, especially on a sentimental level, And yeah, I mean, my last quotation that I always give to people there. In the race of business, data can either make or break your business, and that is relevant to you if you're doing, let's say, a product or service that revolves around the idea of data. Whether you're doing a machine learning model or you're building an AI product, always go back to making sure that you have the right platform, the right data infrastructure from the get-go, the right talent for data-oriented businesses. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this session. You can always go back and check out my Google sessions, on Google, on YouTube. I have talks on game engines. I have talks on reverse engineering as well, or open banking. So there are technical talks and business talks on my YouTube channel as well. Yeah, just go there and let me know what you think. And again, thank you so much for having me here today. I hope you guys really enjoyed this session. You can always reach out to me again on aminatajer.com, or you can check out my, our business work at infiniteware.com. I'm sure you're going to be amazed. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just going to open up for questions now. Let's see if we have any questions. All right, cool. Okay, so Michael is saying, what language is recommended for machine learning? Definitely Python. Believe it or not, I'm not a big fan of I'm not a huge fan of Python, given that I do work with C++ for low-level stuff, mostly operating systems and designing chips and such. But I did a lot of work with machine learning, and it is very clear that the machine learning world really loves Python because it's easy, and the community just supports it out of the box. You get frameworks, you get support from Google with TensorFlow, Keras, whatever that you want to use in machine learning is better suited in Python. And don't take this the wrong way. You can still do development for machine learning using C, C++ if you want, but it's not going to be as convenient as Python, given that Python has the platform, has the support, has the community for it. And if you're just starting, there's no harm of starting with Python because your expectations are already low. But with C++, when you have much control over the platform, when to, let's say, allocate memory, when to deallocate memory, you have control over your program and operating system, it seems much more inferior to use Python sometimes. Where to start to become an ML dev? So there was a library that goes by the name of Keras that started a very cool revolution in machine learning. It allowed people to experiment with machine learning with probably 6 or 10 lines of code. But now, Keras got so good that Google has adopted that framework and they've put it under its wing. Now, when you use TensorFlow, which is a very popular platform, or let's say framework for machine learning, you get Keras out of the box, meaning you can experiment with Keras with probably 6 to 10 lines worth of code. I would definitely advise you to try Keras in TensorFlow 2.0. Do you recommend C# for ML and AI? If you're building a model, that might not seem very convenient today, given, as I said, Python is much more popular. But you can still build your products and services that get information that interact with your model. So what I'm trying to say, if you build a product, the general setup is like the following. You get a model done in Python, trained in Python, and then deployed in a platform, whether you're deploying it on the cloud, you're deploying it on, let's say, on an Arduino, on a Raspberry Pi, or even on a microcontroller. And then to use that functionality, to use that model that you've built, you will probably need to use another piece of software. Now that can either be done in C# or REST APIs, let's say Python or whatever language you want to use, even C or C++, you can do that. So yes, C# and you can use it for calling and inferencing, as we'd like to call it, but I would recommend using Python if you're building a model. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, I think, right, guys? So Abdurrahman, do we have anything else in here?
Actually, you covered a lot of topics. Very nice. So just a quick question. A lot of you mentioned it in the slide, but I want to ask again. إنه واحد build a profile to make your CV better, for example.
Sure.
So this is your recommendation for people who want to apply to a company, for example, to work on their profile, and what else also?
Yeah, so a practical field like software development demands that you have things that work. So what's the point of me having a good resume, a beautiful resume, something really cool that says, hey, I'm good in C, I'm good in C++, I'm good in doing that, I'm good in doing that. But in my resume, there is nothing to prove that I really know what the hell I'm talking about. And so today, businesses are much more aware of what it takes to be in the space. So they will definitely advise you to provide them with your portfolio. And the portfolio itself is something that you can get creative in, whether you're going to build a website that has your products and services, that has sample demos of what you're doing, or you can submit a document that showcases everything. I normally have my website, aminattarju.com, as you can see, and I have a blog that shows people the kind of work that I get involved in, and that is really beautiful for people who want to know what they're getting in terms of experience. So if I'm going to work with Amin, let's see what Amin is good at. Amin has demos in AI. Amin has demos in game development. So, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. He's not just bluffing and he's not just talking about it. He actually has the know-how to put it in a practical fashion, let's say. And so, yeah, I mean, just really networking with people, Abdurrahman, having a proper portfolio. You got to really build a good portfolio if you want to land a job. People like Google, Amazon, and these people, they're very demanding of their employees. They're very demanding, and they're, according to AWS, they're eccentric, which means they take things too far sometimes. And if they don't see your portfolio convincing, they're not going to take you.
Oh, yes. So building projects, it's make experience for the person, right?
Of course, yeah. You got to fail in the beginning. I remember when I built my first game. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go for it.
Oh, yes. Okay. That's my question.
Yes.
I think, yes. Okay.
Go, Abdurrahman. I'm listening to you.
Okay, because I'm developing for someone, I can show them demos. Okay.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah,
so Kamal is asking, okay, if you're working on a private project, how can I display it? One way of doing this, and again, this comes back to the idea of communication, is you talking to other people and explaining to them that you're not going to share too much. It's just, let's say, the front page, for example, or to have a description of what you built for these people, multiple snapshots, multiple screenshots. I mean, this is very debatable again, but the idea is you need to try as much as possible to explain within the limits that you can use of what you built. For example, here in Infinite, where we have commercial products, if you go to our website, we have commercial products, but we never put the source code whenever we showcase the portfolio. We show demos, we show things like that. But it is very tricky, honestly, when you want to have a portfolio out of secret projects. It's very difficult, and you gotta practice your communication skills in here to actually put as much as possible that is within the limits of what you can put.
Yes, okay. One more question.
Sure.
I have a question. What's the most demanded programming language to get a job at Google, Amazon, Microsoft?
This depends big time. So if you're applying for a machine learning job, they're going to grill you hard in Python. And if you're applying, let's say, for an operating system modification company, let's say you're hacking companies, you're building kernels, they're going to ask you about assembly and Linux and C, C++. If you are building, let's say, for Microsoft, a cloud platform, they're going to ask you about your JavaScript, your backend courses. So it's not about the company itself, it's about the discipline that you're getting your hands in.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Amin, for this great presentation.
My pleasure.
And the Q&A session.
Thank you, Abdurrahman, for having me. I had a great time, honestly.
Thank you again. Thank you for your time. So,
sure.
Okay. So
see you guys.
Yeah, see you next